In his new book, Nobodies, columnist John Bowe looks at cheap labor. He profiles companies that rely on a low or unpaid workforce to keep costs low. His talk from the Carnegie Council in New York City lasts about an hour.
Good morning. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Programs, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank our members and guests and C-SPAN Book TV for joining us today. Our guest is John Bowe, and he will be discussing his book, Nobodies, Modern American Slave Labor and Dark Side of the New Global Economy. I'd like to begin by asking a simple question. How many of you have ever stopped to think about who is responsible for this picking the oranges that brought this juice to your table this morning, or the strawberries placed there as well? And have you ever thought about the individual who sewed the label, Made in America, into the clothes that you wear? Take a moment and ask yourself, who are these people? How do they live? And how much are they paid for performing these tasks? The answers just may surprise you as our speaker unravels the connection between our own consumerism and modern slave labor in America today. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution officially abolished and continues to prohibit slavery. Yet it is shocking to learn how little progress has been made in this area since involuntary servitude still continues to flourish in many parts of the U.S. Today, in America, the number of workers who are kept in horrendous work environments where they are paid sub-poverty wages without any benefits, the right to overtime, or the ability to organize, or even leave if they so choose, would shock and appall you. In Nobodies, John Bowe writes about these issues to highlight the abuses and the immense indifference that exists in America, a country that prides itself on being free and democratic. He is passionate and concerned. He draws upon 3 case studies: farm workers in Florida, East Indian labor abuses in Oklahoma, and forced labor in Saipan, a U.S. territory in the Pacific. As he shares his finding, he poignantly demonstrates how globalization and the actual slavery that results because of it have had the effect of degrading not only foreign workers in the U.S. who are abused, but also the character of our society as a whole. As one of our finest investigative reporters, our speaker hopes that by sharing these stories and by studying how free and powerful people respond to unfree and less powerful, perhaps we will then realize the potential hazards of our current enthusiasm for this phenomena we call globalization. Taking advantage of someone's desperation may be more than exploitation, and this is one of the things Mr. Bowe will be exploring this morning. His writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, GQ, and The American Prospect. He has also appeared on NPR's This American Life as well as The Jon Stewart Daily Show. In addition, he is a co-editor of Gig Americans Talk About Their Jobs, one of Harvard Business Review's best books of 2000, and he is the co-screenwriter of the film Basquiat. In 2004, he received the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award, the Sidney Hillman Award for journalists, writers, and public figures who pursue social justice and public policy for the common good, and the Richard J. Margolis Award, dedicated to journalism that combines social concern and humor. Please join me in welcoming someone who cares about what he writes and wants us to be concerned as well. Our guest today, John Bowe. There you go.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here, first off. Second off, I should warn you, I'm a much better writer than a public speaker. And I think I have this tendency to make it seem, I make a lot of jokes and I stumble around a lot and make it seem like I probably don't care about my subject as much as I do. So don't let the smooth taste fool you. I spent 6 years on this book, and it's hard to sum it up in just a few minutes on my feet. So, lately there have been all these books about capitalism and globalization and inequality between rich and poor. And I've been going around for the last couple of weeks on a book tour talking about this, and at every audience people are clearly very concerned about all this. Everybody knows there's something going on, the scales are tipping somehow, and that is somehow problematic, or that just in general in life things should be in balance, and that there's something that looks like it's going out of balance. And I guess what I sort of came to believe while working on this book is that this problem is as scary as global warming. It is this, maybe I'm just making a big deal of my own subject to sell some books, but I don't think so. It's this reversion, sort of inexorable, to a way of life, pre-enlightenment, pre-democracy, we're all created equal, and it's not something that people choose. A lot of it is just sort of the structural, inexorable thing, a lot like global warming. Once it starts and gets momentum, it's too late. Maybe I'm wrong. Currently, the top 1% of American households have gathered more wealth than the entire bottom 95%. Since 1970, the bottom 40% of American households have lost 80% of their wealth. This is all not from the internet. This is from the U.S. Department of Labor, Census Bureau. The same trend of growing inequality is spreading around the world. In the last 20 years, in 59 countries, average income is lower today than it was 20 years ago. The top 1/5 of the world has 80% of the world's income. The poorest fifth has 1%. All of these trends are increasing. 200 or 300 years ago, the difference in per capita income from people in rich countries was 2 or 3 to 1. 100 years ago, that had risen to 10 to 1. It is currently 60 to 1 and rising. And ironically, this change has been partly because of the abolition of slavery, which freed up people's productive capacity to work more, be productive, make more money. And so it's ironic that now that's resulting in this increase in inequality, and that could very possibly lead us back into slavery or something kind of like slavery. There is something that Justice Louis Brandeis said in the 1920s, which coincidentally was the last time that wealth inequality was where it is now in the U.S. And he said, "We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we can't have both." So what this book is very much about, it's about 3 slavery cases here in the U.S. now, today. But it sort of breaks them down into the little psychic components and labor law and human rights law components, the technical thingies that make it possible. And what you realize, this is not a perfect statement or something I could argue scientifically, but what you realize is that slavery is the opposite of democracy. It's the exact perfect opposite. And I guess one point that the book makes is that there are technical components that make these things. There are technical things that take away freedom, technical things that build freedom or enhance or promote freedom. And they're actually fairly simple things. One way in which I'm getting in trouble for this book is I approached it as a writer, not as a policy guy. And that's all I know is journalism and writing. And now that the book has come out, I'm sort of forced to be a policy guy, and I'm not great at it. And the solutions and the things that help a problem like this are so many and so vast and tie into so many different areas of public policy and morality and spirituality, whatever you want. You could talk about 150 different things and you still wouldn't cover it. But one of my primary concerns is just hitting at this blindness that we all bring to the subject. And a friend of mine describing our attitude towards privilege is we can't see it because we can't see it. And there's a structural part of our brain, and it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or liberal or conservative. In many, many parts of this book, when I was hanging around with really, really poor people, it wasn't some big evil corporation screwing over poor little third world workers. It was some guy with a dime, raking over the coals, someone who had a nickel. And so you have to get it out of your head that this is good versus bad. This is human nature. This is everybody. And, and I will put myself in that category too. A while ago I wanted to make some bookshelves. Now, what was my first thought? Did I think, oh, well, I should call the union and find a carpenter and pay him $30 an hour? No, of course not. I thought, there must be some Mexican out there who would be just thrilled to earn $8 or $10 an hour. And I think that everything in this book plays out against this backdrop worldwide. In the back of everybody's mind, there's this calculator running and like, oh, Chinese people make $60 or $70 a month. That's the going rate for labor now. And so, I don't think there are too many drywall plasterers here in this room. We don't care what those guys get paid, and you don't see, and you don't notice, and you don't see, and you don't notice. So anyway, this not noticing is one of the things that I just became obsessed with, and the ways in which we can't see, and there are just 1,000 of them. So very briefly, the first part of the book is about a case in Florida, which I wrote about for the New Yorker, and I heard about it while going around the country interviewing people for the last book I worked on, which was called Gig, Americans Talk About Their Jobs. And that was 125 interviews of people, sort of rich and poor, from supermodels to illegal aliens working in poultry plants, talking about their jobs. And it's just like 125 little documentary films. And I was driving around doing that, and someone in North Carolina told me about some people they knew in Florida who were working on a slavery case. And I thought, well, that seems interesting, slavery. And I went down and checked it out. And I really had no idea what a vast subject slavery is, but really in our heads we should just think of there's music, there's painting, visual arts, whatever, there's dance, and then there's ways in which we screw each other over. And we have probably brought far more ingenuity to the last category and creativity. And I just fell down into this rabbit hole, and I've sort of been there ever since, unfortunately. So anyway, the first part is about this case with some Mexican migrant workers who come up from Florida and cross the border, across the desert into Arizona, and get driven by a guy named Shorty to the swamps in Florida, where they're introduced to their new boss, a guy named El Diablo. El Diablo is diabolic, to say the least. He says, well, do you guys have the money to give Shorty for the ride from Arizona? And these guys, they come from the mountains in southern Mexico. They've never been to the U.S. They don't know Florida from Arizona. They'd never discussed their wages or what they're going to be paid or how much a dollar is or whatever. So when they're told that they owe Shorty $1,000, but El Diablo is going to be gracious enough to pay and give Shorty a check, they think, oh, okay. And this is one of the things that's sort of about globalization. Back in Mexico, in their small villages, they said everything worked on the law of cojones, which was if your boss didn't pay you or something, well, you all lived in the same small town, and if a boss was bad enough, at night everybody would gang up and trash his house or do something. And you just saw these people. But with globalization, of course, you have people affecting each other who don't come from the same place, and that enables all kinds of tricks to be played. Anyway, what happens is El Diablo tells them, if you leave, I'm going to kill you. And El Diablo is a guy who has killed people and kneecapped people and thrown them out of vans, and he's a very scary guy. And during the course of writing about that, of course, I was able to get into the numbers and the structure of the whole agriculture industry. And what is it? Americans pay like 6.5% of our income for food, which is the lowest of any country by a good 50%. Canadians, I think they pay half again as much. Swedes pay about twice as much. And so it's not that we can't afford it. And these companies, agribusiness is the second most profitable sector of the economy after pharmaceuticals. The federal government gives about $47 billion a year to agriculture and various subsidies or another. So the fact that this is the opposite of trickle down. It's just they have a powerless workforce. This, after all, is the industry that brought us slavery 1.0. They have never conceived of themselves, nor have we ever conceived of agriculture as a business that can, could, or should play by normal labor rules. You don't see this in the auto manufacturing business because they have unions. Just for some reason, we've always decided it's okay if farm workers don't get paid. So the story just traces the process by which these guys get sucked into this little world where they're trapped and they can't leave. And there's a great quote from a guy from the INS who says, look, these workers are so powerless. What would you do if you're down on a dirt road, you're 17 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by swamps, and there's someone saying they're going to kill you? If you leave, are you going to leave with your brother or your cousin? How are you going to go? Are you going to go through the swamp? Because you're going to make tracks like a herd of elephants. And heaven help you if these guys find you. And that's what it is. As this guy, one of the slaves described it, he said, I felt like all of a sudden I was in their pocket. And it's just, you see the world just closing down, poof, and that's it. So I should just make clear, because every place I've been going talking about this book, people say, well, are they really slaves? And where do you draw the line at what's a slave? Which makes me want to lash out. And in some cases, of course, the people are paid. You know, they make $30 a week or something like that. So how can that really be a slave? You know, we're talking, in each of these cases, federal prosecutors have decided that, yes, this person was a slave. In each of these cases, you know, we're talking about bosses who rape and kill and are on record raping and killing. I think that's good enough for me. The bottom line is, can you leave your job or not? And I think that's a good baseline. If you can't leave your job, it's probably a problem. So the second part of the book is about a case in Tulsa. And it's about this old Mississippi redneck who's actually a likable guy, kind of a charming old guy. And he's one of those real Americans who says, there's an expletive here, so I'll just bleep myself. He goes, see, I'm one of them Americans, one of them bleeps that works 80 to 100 hours a week. And I've done that since I was about 10 years old. I've had 5 two-week vacations in 40 years. I come from nothing, got to where I am by myself. I never had no mentors, no partners, no nothing. I don't socialize with anybody. I don't even socialize with kinfolk hardly. You know, if you want a piece of the world, you go get it. That's the only way I know. People whine to me that they was raised poor, well, piss on them. Of course, this guy started his business with help from the Small Business Administration, but why quibble? So he and his wife, Tina, who looks like Tammy Faye Baker, started, the late Tammy Faye Baker, started a welding company in the 70s, and it grew to become a big place where they make 200-ton welding, big tanks for oil refining and electricity generation. And so the business prospered, and then with the sort of decline of American manufacturing, he found it harder and harder to keep up with them Koreans and them Chinese who don't have any government regulations and taxes and all that stuff. So he started to feel like he was losing out. So he started a joint venture with some Kuwaitis to make these tanks over in Kuwait. And typically in the Gulf oil states, as most of you probably know, they have imported workers, guest workers from India, the Philippines, Pakistan, and they pay them very little and they treat them very badly. So that's what this guy was going to do. And so he recruited for workers in India and got these very skilled welders. And he decided I wanted to bring them over to Tulsa first for a few weeks and train them to teach them the American way, and before bringing them to Kuwait. So he brought over one group for, I don't know, 3 weeks, I guess, and that worked out okay. He paid them $3 an hour, which was a violation of minimum wage laws, but that's what they were going to be making in Kuwait, so why be inconsistent? And then he shipped them off to Kuwait, and then he brought over another group, same thing, 3 or 4 weeks, and then sent them to Kuwait. And I think at some point the gears started turning, and he was looking at these guys and looking at his American workforce and thinking, now why again am I paying these guys $15, $20 an hour? And here was one of the good things too about the story. He saw himself as a benefactor of the Indians. He was doing them a favor because, of course, they're all starving to death in India, and that's a poor country where they don't have any money. So he wasn't just making a buck or saving money. He was doing them a favor, helping the Indian boys, as he called them. So he devised this whole deal where he would have an Indian recruiting firm find the workers and run them through some tests, and then they would be the nominal employer, and came up with this really complicated deal where he would send their wages to India, he would wire the wages to this company called El Samit, which also did some work for Halliburton in Guantanamo. But and then this company would wire the money back to Tulsa as their wages, and then it would get paid to the workers. It was just sort of hocus pocus that you can do now with the internet. And he also just decided, like, instead of paying them minimum wage, and instead of going through all this labor nonsense like Social Security and health benefits and all that stuff, that if this foreign employer was the employer, they could sort of skip all that. And after all, these workers were just going to be training not really working, so it was sort of a different deal than just working. And at the same time, he thought, well, why should I have these guys like all look for their own apartments? I'll just house them on the company premises, and that way they won't have to do all the work of finding an apartment and wasting their money on rent and all that stuff. And as he explained it, he said, sure, I could have had the recruiting company pay them minimum wage, then let the guys pay for their housing, food, and transportation. But they were only here visiting for a short time. They had no credit, no Social Security, no reason not to treat them as the guests of America they were. So these guys come from India, and they have paid a $2,000 bribe back in India to get the job. And in every single worker I write about, and in every single worker in America who comes here from another country, they come owing somebody money. And it is a threat that probably nobody in this room can really appreciate. $2,000 in India is not a sum of money that you're going to make at almost any job you can get. You've borrowed that money from a loan shark, you're paying 10 to 20% a month in interest. These guys, you know, they have power over you in a way that my student loan company does not have over me. You know, if I default, it's a bummer. I might have some angst about it, but these guys can lose their house, and of course the whole extended family lives in a family compound. So if you lose it, there's this very, very real threat of putting your entire extended family out onto the street, and you will never return to whatever respectability you had. They're dust. So these guys come, you know, and for Mexican workers it's about $1,500 to $2,000. Indian workers, it's about $2,000 to $20,000. I've just found out about a Thai scam. Israeli labor recruiter in LA has brought in 2,000 or 3,000 workers from Thailand. They've all paid about $20,000. They're working right now in 14 different states. The same thing. They take away the passport when they get off the bus, and they say, get to work. And then they just take away money from their paycheck, deductions for this, deductions for that. Nobody speaks English. Nobody can talk about it. So what's interesting about this John Pickle guy is just what an amateur, John Pickle is the name of the Mississippi guy I'm talking about. It's just what an amateur he was. Everybody's doing this stuff, but he put everything on paper. He wrote it up. He said that this is one of the most visionary and forward-looking training programs in the history of cross-cultural business. So here's a little deposition. This guy from the EEOC, who was really great, was questioning him. He said, okay, now, when you and your executives were thinking about putting this deal together, did you consult any other companies to find out how might be some good ways to do it? And this is the old guy answering, no. Did you know if your executives did? No. Mr. Pickle, is it fair to say you don't know all the details that went into the negotiation of each of the terms in this agreement? That's a right statement. He goes, how long have you been president of your company? 30 years. And in that time, have you taken any courses at a college or seminars on employment discrimination? No. How about human resources management courses? No. Have you ever attended any courses on seminars or seminars on harassment? No. How about the Fair Labor Standards Act? Nothing. How about any laws relating to pay generally? Nothing. Immigration issues? None. Now tell me, if you've been president for 30 years and you haven't taken those kinds of courses or training, why is that, Mr. Pickle? Well, I worked with some pretty sharp people and kind of put myself out for them, you know, just learned. So I want to match that kind of calculated ignorance up with what it looks like on the other side. This is a phone call from some workers in Florida. And the way these workers get around from one area to another is with these secret van services that we don't even know about. But you can call from a tiny town, from a tiny Mexican grocery store. You call up, you buy actual tickets. You say, I want to go from this place in the middle of Florida to this place in the middle of North Carolina. And these van services kind of flow with the crop season. So you go from tomatoes or oranges up to cucumbers in North Carolina, or over to Indiana for blueberries or mushrooms or whatever. And these van services for a cheap price will give you a ride. And they'll drop you off in the middle of these small towns. So El Diablo, and he had this sort of network of cousins and in-laws and people he worked with. And they all communicate on their Nextel phones. And they just very much dominate these small rural areas. And when they would see these van services coming to take away workers, whether or not the workers were their own, they would swagger over and say, who's in this van? You know, you're taking our people. And they killed a guy a few years earlier, but the FBI doesn't know how to investigate these cases. You have a tall, 6'2" white guy who doesn't speak Spanish showing up at the trailer home where 10 Mexican guys are working, and he starts speaking in English and barking out, you know, where's Rafael? Is Rafael here? And immediately they just don't want to talk to him. And also these FBI guys, I mean, you can see how September 11 happened because they just have such a poor window into other cultures. And they don't for a minute think of, you know, never mind. I'm not going to go off on that. But they want to work from 9 to 5. Well, these guys are working from 5 in the morning till 7 at night. So how's that going to happen? And so the case never moves forward. Where was that going? Right, so the murder never got resolved, and these bad guys were allowed to keep going. So one part of this story is describing this attack by some workers who were trying to leave. They did not even work for El Diablo, but he thought that maybe they did because one of his workers had run away the day before. So this is what happens when a worker calls 911 in South Florida. And in the background of this cassette tape, you can hear windows being smashed and these people are screaming and it's just total mayhem. So the phone rings. I should have brought the tape, but it's very difficult to understand. The southern woman answers, says, 911, police emergency. And a male Hispanic speaks, speak Hispanic. And the dispatcher says, no, you speak English? And he pauses and he goes, okay, mire, and the dispatcher cuts him off and says, you need police, ambulance, fire, or what? And the caller panics. He says, El Mercadito, Lake Placid. And the dispatcher, she really does seem like she's concerned, but it sounds like impatience on this tape. She says, where? And he says, El Store, Mercadito, Lake Placid. And I'm so tempted to do a Rudy Giuliani. Oh, hi, honey. I'm just talking to the NRA about assault weapons. So the dispatcher says, what? At the store? And he goes, yes. And the dispatcher says, what street? And he goes, 27. She says, okay, what's the problem? And then there's silence, and then there's panic, and then there's shouts in the background. And she screams, she goes, what's the problem? Is there someone there who speaks English? And then the phone hangs up, and you hear this dial tone, and you hear the dispatcher saying, hello? Hello? And it is just heartbreaking. So then the phone rings again, and she says again, 911, what's your emergency? And a different guy starts speaking, and goes, yeah, I need a cop over here because there's been fight with gun. And the dispatcher asks, where at, sir? And he goes, El Mercadito, store. Which Mercadito just means the little store, but it doesn't say which store, and these stores oftentimes don't have names. The dispatcher shouts, he goes, I'm not understanding what you're saying, slow down. And then you hear more bedlam in the background, and he goes, Mercadito is the store. And the dispatcher's, Margaret, spell it. And now a third guy grabs me, hello, hello. You know, and it keeps on going. Finally the guy says, please, it's emergency, here, come quickly, hello, emergency, emergency, everybody have gun. And the phone clicks again, and you just hear this dial tone. And this is a part of the country where we have 300,000 Spanish-speaking people working. They don't get heard. They don't get police protection. If they call the Department of Labor, they get a phone recording, white person speaking not just English, but like special bureaucrat English that just like, we handle these kind of complaints. And then this goes on for about a minute, and at the end she says, oh, and by the way, our office is open from 8 in the morning until 12:30 at noon on Wednesdays. So it's just like, thanks for coming to our country, thanks for picking our fruit. We're not home. Good luck. So, I want to take that little micro view, and what I kind of do in the book is hold that to globalization. You see Thomas Friedman on TV talking about how great globalization is. You look at the world as flat. Every single interview is with the CEO. You know, and there's one little 5-word thing in there where he says, oh yeah, by the way, only 0.02% of Indians are employed in the high-tech sector. But like, meanwhile, you know, the average person, certainly the 30 or 40% of the poorest people in India, have gone down, down, down. I think average kid in India used to get 900 calories a day in the 80s, and now they get 600 calories a day. So like, all right, sounds great. And there's a great quote from Joseph Stiglitz, which I think in a very euphemistic way captures this whole thing, where he says, I think that democratic or political globalization hasn't kept pace with economic globalization. And that is very much a way of describing what's going on here. And so what I worry about, because in all these cases I kept finding, the people doing the enslaving were usually able to present it as a positive. And they said, I'm helping these people. I'm giving them a job. They don't have a... Well, yes, even if I'm doing X, Y, and Z to coerce them, or maybe I'm hiring an armed guard to wait outside the factory premises in Tulsa, but think how little they were making back home. There's this presumption that you can exercise this paternalistic, coercive control because you're doing someone a favor. And so I just read about the hundreds of millions of people around the world we're lifting out of poverty. And I compare that to the Spaniards coming to the New World and helping the American Indians by giving them the benefits of Christianity. And the white colonists helping the Africans by giving them the benefits of civilization. And I just, heaven help us from these people helping each other. I think it's probably the first way to solve this problem. Now, I don't know a lot of times when I've been out talking about this, people start raising their hands and, what are we supposed to do? And I'm worse at that part than complaining and talking about how bad everything is. But there are certainly plenty of things to be done, and really there's an Orwell quote that says, economic and social injustice can stop the moment that we want it to. We just have to decide that we want to do it. But as far as how to do it, there are a million different ways. Anytime anyone brings up something like a global minimum wage, they just get laughed at, and people say, oh my God, that's way too complicated, and that would involve rich countries telling poor countries what to do. I'm like, really? God, let's not do that. And there are consumer campaigns. There's a group that I write about a lot called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, who is this heroic worker advocacy group, sort of this multi-culti mod squad down in the swamps of Florida who've had amazing success. They've teamed up with a lot of church groups and student groups. They had a boycott against Taco Bell. And when I called up Taco Bell, you look at the pricing power that these large buyers of agricultural commodities have, and they really sort of set their own price. It has nothing to do with the free market. Wal-Mart says what they're going to pay. Burger King says what they're going to pay. The farmer doesn't just say, oh, I'm going to hold out for a better price, because if you're a tomato farmer, your tomatoes are going to rot in 3 days if you don't sell them. So when I first called Taco Bell about this, I had this spokesperson on the phone. He says, well, this really... I said, there are slavery cases popping up in the tomato fields. There have been 6 of them in the last few years in Florida. What do you think about that? He goes, well, it's heinous, but I just don't think it has anything to do with us. And what this Coalition of Immokalee Workers managed to do was to finally, over the course of about 4 years, get Taco Bell to agree to pass on an extra penny a pound for the tomatoes they buy, which sounds infinitesimal, but it actually kind of almost doubles the wages of the tomato pickers. And this is interesting because it just totally bypasses any government mechanism, totally just admits the government is no longer helping with this kind of problem, no longer helpful with this kind of problem. We're going to start negotiating with the real power in this world, with corporations. And since Taco Bell, McDonald's was the subject of a campaign, and now they've capitulated, and now they're going after Burger King. So it's actually pretty inspiring to see that these corporate campaigns can work, they do work. I felt good when my article in the New Yorker came out about the Florida case. The biggest shareholder of Taco Bell came into the next shareholders meeting and said, like, what am I doing holding stock in a company like this? And I think, it's just too simplistic to say, oh, corporations are all evil and they don't want to do anything. I think that's bogus, and I think it's lazy. If it threatens their profits, if there's a public relations campaign that's effectively mounted, they don't want to have slaves. We don't want to buy stuff from slaves. Consumers want the same thing. There's a way to iron this out. Anyway, there's a bunch of other stuff, but I will save that for questions and answers as far as policy things or things that can be done to address this. But for now, I should probably just shut up and thank you very much. Take some questions.
Thank you for introducing us to the dark side of globalization. And I'd like to open the floor to questions, and I ask that you identify yourself, and please just wait until the microphone comes to you. Susan? Start.
Susan Gittleson, thank you for telling us about the dark side of our country and suggesting that individuals can help make a difference. The examples you gave were of men, workers. What about women and sexual slavery and women unable to control their own bodies and brought to places that they never expected and sold possibly by their families to need more money? What about that whole story?
Before, when I said that you almost have to look at slavery as being an art form, just like visual arts or dance or music, when I was getting into slavery, it's such a huge subject that you have to choose which neck of the woods you want to specialize in. And there were a couple reasons why I don't even touch that subject with a 20-foot pole. Number one is that has become a lightning rod for controversy between liberals and conservatives. Sex sells, and sex trafficking has been written about, and it's horrible, and it's real, and it does happen. But the way that it's been written about has been kind of exploitive, and by that I mean the cover of the New York Times Magazine. There was an article about 4 years ago by Peter Landesman. This is just amazing to me. They show like a Mexican schoolgirl in a Catholic school uniform from the neck down with her little flesh showing on the cover. It was totally prurient. And this article was also one of the most poorly written. It was a horrible example of journalism. It was super dodgy ethics. Anyway, I didn't want to confuse the two issues. For me, what is germane is what I call labor slavery, and that is the manufacture of products that we all use, that we all consider legitimate. I don't see sex trafficking as being a contagion that could leap out of its bounds and fundamentally alter the way we live. I do see this addiction to cheaper and cheaper prices and cheaper labor as being vaster, more pernicious, and less written about, and less explained. So that's why I don't address that. But it's certainly not the case that I think that's unimportant or not horrible. I just had to choose which horrible thing I want to write about.
Jean Genniger, you were able to uncover El Diablo's activities. Why doesn't government do something about his operations? If you can do it, you can see it. Why don't they see it?
They're not paid to see it. I mean, the reason the book is called Nobodies is because I asked one of the guys at this coalition of Immokalee workers their whole focus, and there are different tactics that people take to address this stuff, but their sole mission really was to educate workers and to teach them their own power and have marches and demonstrations and stuff. And to my way of thinking, when I first started writing about that, that was uncool. These were dated tactics that don't work. I found it embarrassing. I found myself at one of their protests and I was shrinking back. I hate that stuff. And it reminds me of uncool 70s hippies and stuff like that, that I think that's not necessary anymore. That's not how things are done now. And so I was always questioning them and being skeptical of them and asking them, why don't you have a legal campaign? Why don't you have a lawsuit? Why don't you lobby government? And this guy just looked at me like I was so dumb, because I was. He said, don't you get it? We're pelagatos. We're nobodies. We're losers. He goes, nobody looks after you when you're a loser. And that's really true. You look at who gives money to politicians. Well, it's Taco Bell. It's every big corporation. I mean, they get millions and millions and millions of dollars a year from one side of the equation and zero from the other. So we all go to which side our bread is buttered on, that's human nature. They don't exist. And in the book, there's just this battery of things from the Supreme Court, from state legislatures, from the federal government, you know, at every single way, taking these guys from poor and miserable and knocking them down a few pegs from there, taking away every avenue of legal redress until they're just invisible. And it's as calculated and manifest as anything you ever saw. So. And they're not voters, right? Now they're, you know, they don't even have the power to vote, exactly.
John Hirsch. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation, which is part of a whole strand of sort of criticism that's been in a lot of media. There are different ways to look at these problems through sectoral problems, you know, McDonald's, Taco Bell, so national approaches, international approaches. I've thought two of the people who've been here in the past have been Tom Friedman, who you mentioned, and Jeffrey Sachs. And Joanne and I have had this discussion. I've been struck by the difference between Tom Friedman, the world is flat, that the U.S. has to catch up with China and India, on the one hand, and Jeffrey Sachs on the other, who's written this book called An End to Poverty, and which is about lifting the 1 billion or more people in the world from $1 a day to $2 a day. And I'm wondering if you could say something about Jeffrey Sachs's view. In other words, that poverty or deep poverty can be eradicated, but we cannot, in his view, lift everybody to $6 a day. But it would be a big achievement to lift people in Africa from $1 a day to $2 a day. I mean, that juxtaposition is that Friedman ignores the billion who are very poor. So instead of this sort of international minimum wage, which you alluded to, whether you think what's really important would be to bring people up in their own societies, in their own framework, rather than trying to get everybody at a certain level.
Well, I think there's a huge, very dense nexus between economic and social justice. And I'm not smart enough to talk about it that well, and I don't know if anyone is, but I think it's interesting. I was reading a book by a guy named Kevin Bales, who is an expert on slavery, and he's the head of an American group called Free the Slaves, and he's written a book called Ending Slavery. And he writes very compellingly about these very poor villages in India where anti-slavery efforts, like rescuing these kids who had been kidnapped and trafficked into working in looms and making rugs, how when they freed those slaves and brought them to a school for a while where they were fed well and educated and sort of educated about their rights, and then these kids would go back to their villages and at the age of 12 would sort of become village leaders and alert the whole village about trafficking and tell their neighbors, don't sell off your kids for this little fake reward of $5 because it's not going to work out. But also then getting the village to act collectively and fight against the landlords or the local corrupt officials or whoever is keeping them from getting government benefits and keeping them from getting a good pay for whatever commodity they're producing. And so all of this stuff sort of starts with a political process, an awareness, a democratic process, and that leads to the economic process. So I think innately I sort of tend to think from the outside in terms of, well, let's raise their wages, and so does someone like Jeffrey Sachs. But I think there's a whole other approach, which is equally and possibly more valid, which begins with democratic processes. You know, and there's a great quote from, I can't remember who, anyway, who said, show me a man who makes, $3 more a week than his brother-in-law, and I'll show you a happy man. Whether it's they're making $3 a week or $150 a week or $10,000, you know, everything is relative. And I think in a lot of these cases, it really isn't always a question of how much money people are making. It's just a question of, do they feel like wealth is being distributed fairly in their community? And that's a huge part of this. If you address that, you address so many other issues of corruption, nepotism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So.
I'm Ari Zollberg. I really very much appreciate what you've just done, because I've actually visited some of these Florida places, and but I'm wondering about how you deal with these things, because, for example, when Washington recently cracked down on some Mexican immigration, illegal immigration, there were immediate responses in California. Tomato growers started moving down to Mexico. I know you can't move orange trees as quickly as tomato plants, but still, I mean, I think there is that kind of, that stuff really is movable. And I'm not sure that the workers will be better off if they grow tomatoes in Mexico as against in California or Florida. So how do you take that into account in your suggestions?
I say move. If you want to move, move. People have been threatening with that forever and ever and ever. That's sort of the whole thing of globalization, right? If you unionize and you want $9 an hour instead of the 7 we're paying you, we'll just have to move the whole factory from Ohio to China. And at this point, my feeling about that is, okay, move. And when it gets bad enough, people will respond. I mean, what will happen is that enough production will be based outside the U.S., and, 70% of Americans will be jobless, and then they'll militate and they'll get political again. As it is now, I mean, that was one of the really disturbing things. I didn't even talk about the third part of the book. I went off and I lived on this Pacific island called Saipan for 3.5 years. And I don't want to explain the whole thing now because it's super complicated, but what it is a society where 25% of the people are citizens and have passports, and 75% of the citizens are guest workers. And it was really like going back and visiting Greece or Rome or what the United States is going to be like in 50 years. And then I would come back here to New York, and all of my liberal friends would be complaining about Bush and everything. And I'd say, oh, so have you done anything political in the last few years? And they would say, God, you've gotten so cynical. And so now I just feel like, if it's not just people on the right or conservatives or corporate people. I saw that movie Knocked Up recently, and I don't know if many people in this room are big fans of movies like that, but it just has these slacker kids who don't do anything for a job. And they're cute and they're funny because they're such losers and stuff like that. But like, those guys are the problem too. The things that enable them to not have jobs are the fact that people in China are working for $60 a month. That's what lets them have this slackery lifestyle. And now my disdain for those people, like if they don't want to be political and they don't want to be informed about the world, fine, wait 30 years and see what your life is like.
I'm Rachel Kranz. One of the things that I found most moving about the book is kind of what you just said, that you talk a lot about your own progression and your own shift from being cynical and kind of disdainful about political action and what can be accomplished by it, and kind of what people could do for themselves, to really being respectful and admiring and excited about it. And I wondered if there was, it felt the way you wrote it, you kind of put yourself with the people you knew in New York and the people you were used to hanging out with, and what you began to discover that they didn't see. And I wondered if there was more you could say either about your own experience of that, or maybe not exactly the policy version of that, but that feels like another avenue to think about, like what can be done to make the vision that you got from going firsthand something that people can get via reading your book. Or do you know what I'm asking? Like, is there some way of thinking about how people can start seeing these things that have been so invisible? And it sounds like you had a lot of experience mediating between this world where people saw it and where people didn't. Not just how bad it was, but the idea that action and political action could do something about it, that there wasn't a reason to be completely despairing because the coalition of Immokalee workers could be successful.
Well, I think if I understand your question correctly, I would say that I don't want to tell other people what to do, but most people are concerned with this stuff. Most people care about this stuff, rich or poor. They don't want to live in a world with slavery, but then when they look at this whole thing, they just think, oh, this is too big. What can I really do? It's hopeless. And I think the important thing is to do something. You're not going to take on the whole economy at once. One person is not going to stop the juggernaut of globalization. But if you use that as an excuse to do nothing, that's pretty lame. And that's not really acceptable. And so I guess my own journey is now like, I don't want to hear a second of complaining. I'm so uninterested in hearing anybody complain about anything. And I've gone to a lot of these readings and people raise their hand, oh, and there's another thing, and there's another thing, and they complain. And I've gotten really rude where I'll just say, like, give me an answer, don't give me a problem. And really, if you start looking into the stuff, there are a million things to do. There are fair food campaigns, there are these corporate campaigns. You could write, now that the Democrats control Congress, why not start writing Ted Kennedy and George Miller, who control the labor committees, and say, you know what? The budget for the Department of Labor has been going down and down and down for 30 years, ever since Reagan got elected. Now there is one Department of Labor inspector for every 150,000 workers. It used to be one inspector for every 30,000 workers. That right there is just, that's the problem. Why don't we hire more Spanish-speaking DOL employees? Why don't we even hire some short, Indians from southern Mexico, from the hills down there, so that they can go investigate conditions where their own people are working, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever one of those things you like, great. Don't do 20 things, do 2 things, and do them avidly. Is that, okay.
My name is Jerry Fuchs. Don't be inhibited about being a speaker. You're really terrific.
I got lucky today.
We had a speaker here in the last few weeks who's a major voice, a religious voice, and the discussion was the separation of church and state. And in the course of his conversation, he actually made the distinction that slavery is not mentioned in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. I don't think he was proposing slavery. He was trying to show that there are political issues that have to be decided by citizens, and there are religious issues. I found myself sort of taken back by his interpretation of that. The question that I have for you is, where is the role of the religious people or the churches or synagogues in this issue? I mean, this is such a remarkable story, and if there's any place for religion in this world, it seems to stand up for issues that you're describing.
I think that the role of religion in this country is always poorly reported, because it's always reported by educated elites from either coast who don't venture often enough into the hinterlands. I think the whole quote-unquote rise of religion was just stupidly reported. I used to go hitchhike and ride freight trains and go meet just regular people at random, and I did it for that reason, so I could just see what's out there. I was fascinated. And the number of super religious people I met was incredible. I would get these really great people practice, like people wanting to be preachers. People would pick me up and say, hey, I just picked you up because I want to practice my sermon. And can I do that? And it was just like indie rockers or indie filmmakers. This was a way to be cool in your community. And I found that, a lot of times it was charming, or it might be a whole bunch of racism buttressed up with something completely charming and inspired. And anyway, I sort of always felt like, God, there's about 30% of the people out there, and that's what they care about. And I think this whole reporting of the rise of it and this whole characterization of it as being this redneck, only conservative, only anti-gay, pro-life, anti-abortion contingent is ludicrous. It's nonsense. I mean, the Bible mentions social justice a million times more than it mentions gay bashing. There's a lot of stuff in there. I think there's a huge contingent of religious people in this country that are sort of waiting for leadership. Remember when that guy, somebody a few years ago came out with that "What would Jesus drive?" thing, that anti-SUV thing, and that was like the first time in a while I heard some kind of progressive note coming out of the reporting on that world. But I think a huge chunk of that world could just as easily be lured to the quote-unquote liberal, which I don't think of liberal anymore, but that side of American debate. And there's a lot of energy waiting to work on this stuff, if anybody talked about this stuff in a more clear way.
I'm David Hunt. John, I was struck by your comment about the FBI investigating this murder, and obviously what you said about the rigidity of their work habits, their personalities, has wider ramifications, particularly against terrorism, lack of cross-cultural awareness. But did you happen to go into any FBI field office down there and talk to them or supervisor about the appropriateness of their people and their training and their ability to operate in that environment? Or do you just, I don't know whether you had a chance to do that, but it would have been interesting just to see what their reaction might have been.
I talked to different people at the Department of Justice and different FBI investigators, and also some INS investigators, and what I found in most cases were there were people who were genuinely interested in tackling this kind of crime, and it took them a couple years to learn how to do it, but eventually they did, and then they would get transferred to bank robbery in Pennsylvania. And that just happened again and again and again. And a lot of these people kept up their interest in trafficking and slavery cases, and they would try very hard to inform other people, but just institutionally there was a structural problem that kind of, they kept throwing away whatever expertise was accruing. And with the Department of Justice, I mean, A, they're being racked by all this nonsense from above, but also just even the most well-meaning people, these cases are incredibly hard to try because you're dealing with populations that are scared, they're broke, they don't have the money or leisure or patience to sit around for 2 or 3 years while the wheels of justice do their slow process. And they need to be sending money back home to pay for the sick kid or to pay for the debt that's getting 15% interest a month. Nor do they have any reason to trust the government since they come from countries where the government is corrupt. So it takes so many people, and these community groups are really essential, to bridge the gap between the FBI, the investigator, and the worker, or between the DOJ, the prosecutors, and the FBI, and the worker. So they need to be finding food for these people and translating and doing social services and calming down anybody who's been through this traumatic experience. And all of that stuff needs to be working. I don't really suspect that anytime soon the FBI is going to develop an ability to do that. But they are developing an awareness that they need to work with these community groups. And I think that's the beginning of something that might be good enough.
My name is Meyer Pincus, and I want to thank you for the book, first of all, for writing the book, and for the dealing with an issue that I think has been one of the biggest disgraces this country has had since 1865. Is there anyone on the scene politically, and I mean on the national level, who seems sensitive to some of these issues?
No. To be honest, I tuned out largely from American politics and just focusing more, not politics as a whole, but I'm not that inspired by seeing one person who is subsidized by corporate America running against another. That is no longer interesting to me.
I'm not either. That's why I asked the question.
Well, I think John Edwards actually for somebody to actually bring up class and race after 30 years of hearing this nonsense argument that class isn't important or that if you bring it up you're a troublemaker or you're dumb, just to mention the word class and to just start introducing the notion like that's life, that's the sport, that's the game. Of course it's class struggle, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the whole tune. And so I think someone embracing that is exciting.
Yeah, I happen to agree with it. I think Edwards is the only one who has had the courage to even open up discussion on that subject.
And, sorry.
We'll take the last question.
Could you talk a little bit more about the issue of legalization? It seems to me most of the cases you've talked about really concern illegal immigrants and their powerlessness. Would it not really, in a structural sense, be addressed in a large way if legalization could move ahead faster? And what do you think the prospects are for that?
A couple different parts of the answer, I think. One is agriculture has been a bad egg forever. These are the people who brought us slavery the first time. Since slavery has been abolished, there's been one ruse after another, like tenant farming, chain gang labor. They used POWs from Germany for a while. Any source of labor they can get, one guest worker program after another. You read the history of any guest worker program, whether it's German redemptioners coming to the colonies in the 1700s, all the way up to H-2A workers now, they get abused every time. They are brought in by the business elite and the political elite, and they always undermine the working population of every area. It's a very non-democratically arrived at decision. The local population is always angry about it, and their wages go down because here's a captive population, one that is not equal to full citizenship level. And really, this is just something I'm rabid about and focus on very specifically in the book. The difference between citizen and non-citizen is enormous. It is radical, and introducing non-citizens is corrosive. What's going on now with illegal aliens is the latest wrinkle on a very old problem. But the problem is not that they're illegal. That's just what's being seized upon right now to gain an advantage. But then you flip that around, and the problem that they're illegal, the fact of their illegality, and the fact that there are not 10 million of them, but as a Bear Stearns report said a couple of years ago, it's more like 20. This report was warning investors to not believe the U.S. Census, that they needed to know the real picture. So these guys are not exactly Bolsheviks over there. That's a huge percent of the population. I liken it to introducing AIDS into a body. It might only be a few cells that are HIV infective, but it has a really big effect. You do not want to have non-citizens floating around your otherwise free polity, because it totally ruins that idea of all people are created equal. And so in the end, I arrive at a sort of a very, very conservative position on immigration. The current immigration debate includes Senators Feinstein and Kennedy joining up with Bush and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to argue that we need to increase the guest worker program from the H-2A program, what it is now like 120,000 workers, to something like 500 to 700,000 guest workers. That is a disaster. That is the quickest way to suicide that I can think of in terms of working people's wages. You know, you're just going to pit these people who are already taking it on the chin against these people who have they're not citizens. They can't vote. They can't fight for their job rights or anything. So I don't know what the answer is as far as how to clean up the current mess, but I have to say having guest workers and stuff like that is horrible. I think they need to go after employers. I think they need to, Social Security numbers are the key. It's very easy to check whether a Social Security number is valid or not. And as long as you can make it so people will quit screwing around with that, if they put in $1 billion a year would take care of that problem. Anyway, thanks.
John Bow's work has appeared in The New Yorker, GQ, and The American Prospect. He's co-editor of Gig, Americans Talk About Their Jobs. To read his blog, visit John Bow.
I think I have this tendency to make it seem, I make a lot of jokes and I stumble around a lot and make it seem like I probably don't care about my subject as much as I do. So don't let the smooth taste fool you. I spent 6 years on this book, and it's hard to sum it up in just a few minutes on my feet. So, lately there have been all these books about capitalism and globalization and inequality between rich and poor. And I've been going around for the last couple of weeks on a book tour talking about this, and at every audience people are clearly very concerned about all this. Everybody knows there's something going on, the scales are tipping somehow, and that is somehow problematic, or that just in general in life things should be in balance, and that there's something that looks like it's going out of balance. And I guess what I sort of came to believe while working on this book is that this problem is as scary as global warming. It is this, maybe I'm just making a big deal of my own subject to sell some books, but I don't think so. It's this reversion, sort of inexorable, to a way of life, pre-enlightenment, pre-democracy, we're all created equal, and it's not something that people choose. A lot of it is just sort of the structural, inexorable thing, a lot like global warming. Once it starts and gets momentum, it's too late. Maybe I'm wrong. Currently, the top 1% of American households have gathered more wealth than the entire bottom 95%. Since 1970, the bottom 40% of American households have lost 80% of their wealth. This is all not from the internet. This is from the U.S. Department of Labor, Census Bureau. The same trend of growing inequality is spreading around the world. In the last 20 years, in 59 countries, average income is lower today than it was 20 years ago. The top 1/5 of the world has 80% of the world's income. The poorest fifth has 1%. All of these trends are increasing. 200 or 300 years ago, the difference in per capita income from people in rich countries was 2 or 3 to 1. 100 years ago, that had risen to 10 to 1. It is currently 60 to 1 and rising. And ironically, this change has been partly because of the abolition of slavery.
Abolished and continues to prohibit slavery. Yet it is shocking to learn how little progress has been made in this area since involuntary servitude still continues to flourish in many parts of the U.S. Today, in America, the number of workers who are kept in horrendous work environments where they are paid sub-poverty wages without any benefits, the right to overtime, or the ability to organize, or even leave if they so choose, would shock and appall you. In Nobodies, John Bowe writes about these issues to highlight the abuses and the immense indifference that exists in America, a country that prides itself on being free and democratic. He is passionate and concerned. He draws upon 3 case studies: farm workers in Florida, East Indian labor abuses in Oklahoma, and forced labor in Saipan, a U.S. territory in the Pacific. As he shares his finding, he poignantly demonstrates how globalization and the actual slavery that results because of it have had the effect of degrading not only foreign workers in the U.S. who are abused, but also the character of our society as a whole. As one of our finest investigative reporters, our speaker hopes that by sharing these stories and by studying how free and powerful people respond to unfree and less powerful, perhaps.
In his new book, Nobodies, columnist John Bowe looks at cheap labor. He profiles companies that rely on a low or unpaid workforce to keep costs low. His talk from the Carnegie Council in New York City lasts about an hour.
Good morning. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Programs, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank our members and guests and C-SPAN Book TV for joining us today. Our guest is John Bowe, and he will be discussing his book, Nobodies: Modern American Slave Labor and Dark Side of the New Global Economy. I'd like to begin by asking a simple question. How many of you have ever stopped to think about who is responsible for this picking the oranges that brought this juice to your table this morning, or the strawberries placed there as well? And have you ever thought about the individual who sewed the label, "Made in America," into the clothes that you wear? Take a moment and ask yourself, who are these people? How do they live? And how much are they paid for performing these tasks? The answers just may surprise you as our speaker unravels the connection between our own consumerism and modern slave labor in America today. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution officially will then realize the potential hazards of our current enthusiasm for this phenomena we call globalization. Taking advantage of someone's desperation may be more than exploitation, and this is one of the things Mr. Bowe will be exploring this morning. His writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, GQ, and The American Prospect. He has also appeared on NPR's This American Life, as well as The Jon Stewart Daily Show. In addition, he is a co-editor of Gig Americans Talk About Their Jobs, one of Harvard Business Review's best books of 2000, and he is the co-screenwriter of the film Basquiat. In 2004, he received the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award, the Sidney Hillman Award for journalists, writers, and public figures who pursue social justice and public policy for the common good, and the Richard J. Margolis Award, dedicated to journalism that combines social concern and humor. Please join me in welcoming someone who cares about what he writes and wants us to be concerned as well. Our guest today, John Bowe. There you go.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here, first off. Second off, I should warn you, I'm a much better writer than a public speaker. And